Let me know when we're good to go, please.
It is now recording. Thank you.
Okay, so let's pick it back up. We've got a nice block of time here to walk through some ideas on your process, what we're calling a process roadmap or a draft process roadmap for the Vermont Climate Council. I've got some slides to share. Before we get into this, I thought Secretary Young could help frame up our conversation and why we're having this conversation now and the importance of it. So Secretary Young, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, David. I think our guest speakers made my job here much easier, and this is a really nice transition from their presentations to the upcoming discussion. I know that many of us have been anxious about our process and how we're going to proceed with the work that we have in front of us, and perhaps the only anxiety elevation I had from the last processes was really getting a good look at how other states have done it and how much effort, how many voices, and how much work we have ahead of us. But I'm confident we're going to be able to do it. And my takeaway actually was from Massachusetts, the message of process and patience, and from New York, setting up processes and trusting them. And I think that's what we're going to try to achieve in the next conversation with Dave as the facilitator is come up with some processes that we can all trust and have confidence in and commit to as we move forward. So I think it's going to be a great discussion, and I hope folks do engage and tell us how you feel, because this is really, I think the next big step we have to take to transition to getting this work done. So thank you everybody again for your patience with this process, and I really appreciate it and look forward to this discussion.
Super. Thanks so much, Secretary Young. Okay. I'm going to lay out some ideas, and many of you know that we have spoken to the large majority of you council members, either myself or my colleagues, Catherine Morris or Patrick Field, over the last 7 days or so. And we've been talking about these issues of process, these issues of how you get the work done, how you manage your leadership, how you manage the coordination, how you make decisions, right? So we've been having some conversations with you, and then on the basis of our own experience here at the Consensus Building Institute and leading somewhat similar processes, we're going to put forward some ideas as the basis of discussion. You can call it a straw person or straw dog proposal, but the purpose is to generate conversation and get the 23 of you really coming to terms with how are we going to work together as a group and produce something powerful as a group, okay? So what I will do is put forward some ideas on the table. If you really hate them, you can blame CDI, because we're the ones putting the ideas on the table. We've tested some of them with many of you, but let's see how it goes. And then I'm going to suggest a couple things that would be really wonderful if in today's conversation, we're able to say, yep, that's the path, because that allows you to make some immediate steps in the coming days and weeks. There's other pieces to this puzzle that are going to take some more time to digest, and those you'll circle back at your next meeting, and I think there'll be a proposal at the end of this to maybe meet sooner than usual, perhaps in the next 2 weeks or so, to really finalize all this. But let me share my screen, and I'll put some ideas on the table. If you let me walk through it all, then on the back end, let's structure a conversation around some of these key pieces. All right, so if Teams cooperates with me, I will share my screen. Give me a second. And I will try to put this in full screen so it's easier for you all to see. How's that looking? Good? Okay. So as I said, these are some draft ideas, many of which we have been discussing with you over the last week. And let's see how they land today and how they spark a conversation among the 23 council members. There's 4 big ideas that I'd like to put on the table today for discussion. and they're here on this slide. One is about the leadership of the council itself in transitioning to what we're calling a steering committee structure. And it'd be great today if we can get our heads around and agree on what that structure should look like. The exact names may need a few more days and or week or so to sort out. But if we're able to get our minds around what we're doing here, that would be fantastic today. And I'll get more specific about what that might look like. The second piece in the yellow over there is the subcommittee structure. Your enabling legislation sets up subcommittees. It's fairly specific on tasks, etc. It also allows you to add some additional subcommittees if you want, and it gives you some general ideas about composition. But there's some more specificity that we can get into today that will really make the difference about how these function. Again, there are things to resolve later, but there are some things we may be able to circle in on today that will allow you to stand these up sooner rather than later. In the green on the bottom there, a method for decision making. We've spoken a lot about this. We've heard about it today from our presenters as well. What does consensus mean? What does that mean for our process? Do we want to go there? What does it mean, the fact that as enabling legislation, there is a majority rule mentioned, voting rule in that legislation? How does that all make sense in the context of implementation? So we'll talk a little bit about that. We probably need some more time to digest. And so I would be doubtful that today there's a broad sense of agreement around that, but you never know. And then the fourth piece is around public engagement, and should read public and stakeholder engagement. And we wanted to put some specific ideas on the table. We saw how some of the other states have done it, and we thought it'd be helpful just to say, this might be a pathway for you. Okay, let's dive into this. This should not be long. I've only got about 8 slides here, and then I'll open it up for us to start talking about it. Okay, roles and composition. If it looks like I'm looking a little sideways, it's because I have 2 screens, and apologies, I have this other thing on my other screen. I'm not looking out the window. Steering committee. This is something that's been spoken about. I know there's even been email traffic amongst yourselves about this. It feels like an emerging essential idea for you, and it would be an important evolution for you as a group to have some shared leadership of the overall council. So how would this work? The steering committee would have roles around particularly setting up your meetings, your agenda, how you're going to handle your conversations as a 23-member council. It would also provide some overall leadership on various pieces of the puzzle, whether it's developing the slate of subcommittee members together with you as the full 23, whether it's putting together some common frameworks for the subcommittees to do their work, whether it's channeling along with staff and Jane and her staff these requests for technical support to give some order to that, and overall have a role in tracking progress and making sure that the process is working as envisioned. Okay, so those are roles. Composition, you can see what we're suggesting. We heard different versions of that from some of you. This seemed like the most likely version to succeed, where you would have 2 members from the executive branch, your current council chair, Secretary Young, and together with Secretary Moore, who really holds the purse strings here and is the implementer in chief. So important to have Secretary Moore involved. And then we suggest 3 members from among the appointed members of your council. And when you select those 3 members, try to do 1 from the House appointed members and 1 from the Senate and 1 from either. And we really see it as the appropriate decision of those appointed members, those of you who were appointed by the House and the Senate, to choose amongst yourselves, right? So the administrative, the executive branch members aren't involved in that decision, and we can talk a little bit about that today. I'm going to suggest today, if folks want to raise their hand for that potential role, that we do that today, and we'll see where we are, and then you all can make a process to finalize who those 3 would be in the coming days. Okay, so that's a steering committee to help provide some overall to you. Let me move forward. Subcommittees. I got 2 slides on subcommittees here. One is about roles, okay? The core function here being just as you've seen in Maine and in New York, where these subcommittees, they had different names in Maine and New York, but essentially have the heavy lifting task of developing recommended draft strategies or initiatives or programs, essentially the draft content that will go into your climate action plan, okay? That work starts by doing the inventorying of what exists now, just as your enabling legislation requires you to do. But you are, as a council, saying, go forth, subcommittees, and develop some content. Okay? It's important to emphasize that that is draft content that comes back to you as a full committee, as a full council, for your review, your refinement, and obviously your compilation into a unified climate action plan that fits together as a single document. Composition-wise, we've heard the importance of pulling in additional expertise and viewpoints. So incorporating council and non-council members while keeping the numbers relatively small. I think this was one of the learnings you heard from Hannah Pingree, was the numbers got pretty big, and that got pretty unwieldy in Maine. In addition to including non-council members, we heard concerns about non-council members being part of these groups, given that it is you, the 23 council members, who have a specific mandate to come up with this plan. To address those concerns, we're suggesting 2 things. One is, wherever possible, have a majority of council members on these subcommittees. And 2, you could make a decision-making rule in your subcommittees that when it comes time to really decide what gets elevated up to the full council, that could be a decision of just the council members who are part of the subcommittees, right? Those are ways to address the concerns we heard while also recognizing an urgent need to pull in additional expertise and additional viewpoints into these subcommittees. Some pretty straightforward criteria about who should be members of these subcommittees. You need relevant expertise. You need some balance, both from a sectoral, a geographic, and other things that you would determine. Your equity lens will be important here. And it's also important to note that just as in other states, there will be and should be agency staff support for these subcommittees. Okay, so dedicated staff support to help with the lifting of actually getting the work done in these committees. Let me push forward. In terms of leadership, we see the importance of co-chairs, where one of the co-chairs comes from the executive branch, a council member from the executive branch or designee. One of the things we've seen work well in other states is, instead of having the secretary involved, having a high-level person in the agency with significant subject matter expertise be the person involved. A second co-chair would be one of you council members from the legislative appointed members. There may be cases where you may consider a third co-chair and someone from outside your ranks as the Climate Council. There may be areas in which you simply view you don't have the right expertise. And one of the areas we've heard from some of you is perhaps in the Just Transitions Group, Subcommittee, or others. So we just flagged that there may be situations where you may find that. We're not entirely sure yet. Again, key attributes for co-chairs: time. We know this is going to be a brutal investment of time to get, particularly at the velocity that you are seeking to work at. I remember I did a small little chuckle to myself as your colleague from New York said their velocity was fast, and looking at several years worth of work where you're trying to do this in a year. So this is going to require some time, availability, substantive expertise, and obviously a mindset and a willingness to work collaboratively in a subcommittee. Co-chairs, in addition to guiding their subcommittees, will work with other co-chairs and to provide some coordination across these committees, because there is some butting up and overlapping of topics, and that's going to require some substantive coordination. We suggest a 4-step process for rapidly standing up your subcommittees and getting the membership going. We think you all as council members should initially indicate your preference about where you might want to invest some time. If you believe you have time to invest in these subcommittees, we hope you do have time to invest in a subcommittee. We also think after you see, like, as you shake out into different subcommittees, you can see where there's gaps, suggesting additional individuals who are not council members who would be good additions to those. And then we think the steering committee would be a great place to take all those suggestions from you all as council members, try to make sense of them and come up with a slate across the subcommittees. And then you all as a council would confirm that slate. That all can happen relatively quickly. If there's an agreement around, that's the way to go. One thing that we haven't put in this slide deck is the actual what subcommittees. And I'll just mention quickly that, as you know, the legislation calls for 4 subcommittees, and there's been a strong interest in adding a 5th subcommittee around science and technical work that will be supportive of the work of the other subcommittees. But that's the idea right now, is use the 4 in the legislation and add a technical and science and technical subcommittee. Okay, so that's subcommittees. Decision making. Let me just push this up. All right. As you may have heard earlier, the name of our organization is the Consensus Building Institute. So, you know, it's not surprising that we may be using words like consensus here. We've talked about this with a number of you. It's a real dilemma, right? How to make decisions that will ensure strong buy-in and will ensure speedy implementation. We're making a pitch here that striving for consensus is a smart move for you as a council. It's a smart move because it makes your recommendations politically more powerful, and it raises the possibility of a speedier implementation and fewer roadblocks on the back end, right? So what does that mean to work by consensus? We like to talk about it as everyone, or almost everyone, can live with what you're doing. And that's going to require to creatively problem solve. It's going to require understanding, deeply understanding concerns that arise and see if you can work around those concerns. And it's going to require understanding where it is you want to put your priorities and where your priorities are a little bit less. Okay, we suggest in this consensus, it's your process decisions about how you know what you're doing, as well as the content decisions in your climate action plan. If there are disagreements that arise around process that just aren't working through consensus, where everyone or almost everyone can live with it, you've got a majority voting mechanism, and you'll have a steering committee, which hopefully will address a lot of these process concerns, okay? For disagreements that may come up as you get into the content of your climate action plan, there's a couple pathways here. One is that climate action plan can include more than one viewpoint on a specific issue where there simply is not broad consensus. So you can insert into your climate action plan on those specific issues those different viewpoints. We strongly recommend against having majority and minority reports. We believe one single report is the smart way to go. And the individual issues that are causing the stress and strain and causing the different viewpoints are where you specified those different viewpoints. You always have your majority backup, majority vote protocol backup, as stipulated in the legislation. That doesn't go away. You have that as a tool in your back pocket. Again, we think there's some very compelling reasons to push hard for as broad a support as possible for your climate action plan. Okay, So that's what we're suggesting, and it may feel a little bit like a hybrid of those who are accustomed to more of a majority voting, or those who might be accustomed to consensus. I will say, just as a quick word, consensus is not some sort of ideal or a kumbaya moment around a campfire. Consensus is done eyes wide open around what does this achieve in terms of my implementation success on the back end of this. Okay, last piece, public and stakeholder engagement. In terms of stakeholder engagement, there are multiple levels already baked into your process in terms of the composition of you all as a council, and also the composition, the future composition of the subcommittees. And then we would strongly encourage subcommittees to do targeted outreach to bring in additional voices. I think Maureen said it as clearly as possible from New York, to bring in those additional voices that may not be at the table that would be important to have present in your conversations. Periodically invite folks, or the co-chairs do that outreach. So stakeholder engagement feels pretty robust in what you already have set up, and would be made stronger by a concerted effort by subcommittees to do targeted outreach. Public engagement can occur on multiple levels, and we are recommending 2 specific moments throughout this year-long process to specifically go out and create a space for robust public interaction and engagement. One is when your subcommittees are getting ready to lift up draft ideas and recommendations to the full council. We would recommend that subcommittees on a subcommittee level do some kind of public engagement. Again, whatever that looks like, it'll depend in terms of the virus and other things, but some kind of interaction, concerted public interaction around those draft ideas that are emerging. And second, as the council starts to pull together its draft action plan and has something draft to share, that it do a concerted effort, and that would probably be closer to October this year, to go out and do input sessions and aggressively try to solicit public engagement around that draft plan. Of course, all meetings, just like this one, are open to the public and the subcommittees as well, and very encouraging of public participation. And most, I put most, perhaps most/all, have some sort of defined public comment period in them as well. Again, as a way of permanently carrying folks along who are deeply interested in your work. Okay, finally, I'm just going to mention this quickly because Jane was introduced at the top of this call. There will be staff support of this process. You have a project manager in place, or almost in place, as Jane makes the transition over to this. Her job will be to keep track of the moving pieces, to manage those moving pieces, to ensure nothing gets dropped, and to keep the overall machine working. She'll also oversee contractors. She'll shepherd written deliverables as you get closer to having draft action plan and then a final action plan. She'll be playing a big role in getting that drafting going and making sense of all the work of the subcommittees. Agency staff, as I mentioned, each subcommittee will need to have some agency, some sort of staff support from the agency to help prepare those meeting inputs for the subcommittees, work with meeting planning with co-chairs, drafting the outputs. So different ways those staff can be particularly helpful in this process. And there will be coordination with the project manager around staff support. So it's not disparate, but instead a coordinated effort. So I can imagine going forward that your co-chairs and the respective staff support will be doing coordination meetings around content in the subcommittees. All right, that's it. That's all I wanted to put on the table today as a pathway, a process roadmap to spark conversation amongst all of you. As I mentioned at the beginning, it would be particularly beneficial for you if there is a way that today you can find some area of agreement around your steering committee structure and the basics around your subcommittees. And if you're able to find some agreement today, that allows you over the coming days to start standing those up and getting going. If it needs more time, it needs more time. Other pieces of this puzzle, let's talk about them today, and I bet you'll come back in a couple weeks and finalize this as a process roadmap. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see you. We can always pull these slides back up if you want to reference them. They are also in the agenda as a hyperlink in the agenda, the published agenda, so anybody can look at them there. I'm just going to take a moment to let my Teams come back to life. There it goes. Okay, so this is what I'd love to do. I would love to have a sort of semi-orderly conversation about these issues. And my instinct would be to start with the steering committee issue and do around a sort of conversation about the steering committee and what was proposed on this slide and what seems to make sense or any improvements or recommendations you all might make. And let's see where that takes us. And then we'll start talking about subcommittees and see where that takes us. And then we can weave in the decision-making and the other pieces of the puzzle we talked about. I do that just so we keep track of it. If folks need to jump around and mention different things, that's okay. But I'd prefer to have a semi-ordered structure this, and I'll help facilitate this conversation. Okay, so steering committee. This is an idea, it's a pretty big, important shift from what you have right now. And I'd welcome some thoughts to say what you think will make this work well. If you have some really strong negative reaction to this, it's a good time to bring that up as well. So let me just say, please use the raised hand function in Teams. If you're having a hard time finding it, it should be in that little bar right at the bottom where you have the mute button and all that, there's a little hand. If you can't find it, just open up your mic and shout out, and I can make a cue as well. But let's talk about the steering committee. How is this landing? Are people feeling good about that? What would council members like to see perhaps as improvements to what I suggested so that this might get stood up sooner rather than later? Erica, please go ahead.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Generally supportive of the steering committee concept. I think this is going to be extremely important given the body of work that we have to accomplish in a period of time. And so it's going to be very important for the steering committee to be able to give us some succinct and clear direction, especially as the subcommittees begin their work. Because as we've seen, especially in some of the other states' presentations, what could or couldn't be included in a climate action plan could be as broad or as narrow as we want it to be. So we'll need to have some real clear lane bumpers and parameters for what we want to accomplish or what the subcommittees are to accomplish, and an ongoing guidance when the subcommittees run into roadblocks. And I think the steering committee can help with that.
That's great. Thanks, Erica. Richard?
So I'm generally in support of a proposal to create a steering committee. I think it's really important considering that the members of the council have come to the council from 3 different appointing authorities, that the responsibilities on the steering committee be shared across those 3 appointing authorities. We can have a small debate over whether it should be 5-member steering committee or a 6-member steering committee. I'll park that for the moment, but I'd like to just make I have one question and one principled point. I think it's important for us to appreciate that the steering committee should see itself as acting in service to the council. It's not intended to run the council or to be in charge of everything, but rather to be in charge of organizing our work, helping us organize into working groups and aligning the missions of the working groups. So I just want to, plant a flag on the notion that the steering committee should be in service to the council. And I believe that's easily accomplished. I think that people will probably agree with that. And I would like to ask CBI or perhaps others with expertise on the council for suggestions on the following point. I really agree that the legislative appointees should organize themselves to nominate the members that they would like to see on the steering committee. And there's just a question of process, you know, what's the best way to do that in a really collaborative way?
Thanks, Rich. And I'm happy to provide some ideas on that. I'll write that down and not do that right now. So
Okay.
we can do another round.
Yeah.
The comments, but I thank you for that. Do folks, does anybody have a different view than what's expressed so far, just from the council members? Because what we're hearing is generally sounds like a good idea. Let's have a quick conversation about 5 or 6. Can be particularly helpful in setting some, you know, lane bumpers, was the expression. And let's not forget that it is in the service of the Climate Council, not somehow controlling the Climate Council. Okay, great. Are there other viewpoints that folks want to put out there on the table right now about this idea of a steering committee? Okay, great. And does anybody have a particularly strong opinion about whether it's a 5-member group or 6-member group? Do folks have a strong opinion? I'll say from our experience that there is value in having it be representative, but not unwieldy, right? So there's a sweet spot there, whether it's 5 or 6, I'm not sure. But if anybody has a strong view, why don't we do that right now and see if there's folks from the council who feel strongly one way or the other. Okay.
This is Jared. Oh,
yeah. Go ahead, Jared. Yeah.
And I put my comment in the chat, but for folks who are joining by phone and can't see that, I'll just say that I think given the kind of equal responsibility and the kind of division of labor that's outlined in the statute, I think we'd be on most solid ground if we follow that approach of having equal number of members from each appointing authority. And so I would recommend that we have a 6-member steering committee with 2 members each from each of the appointing authorities.
Okay, thanks, Jerry. Joanna?
I just will now say I concur with Jared.
Excellent. Okay. Okay. Anybody else have a strong feeling about this? The other way?
This is Sophia. I just wanted to also third what Jared said.
Okay. Great. Thanks, Sophia. Okay. So it feels like having an equal number from the executive branch, from those who are appointed by the Senate, those who are appointed by the House, has some logic to it, and that feels strongly from those who've spoken. Okay, great. Anything else that folks want to mention? And then I'll answer Richard's question about how to practically do this. Any other questions about the steering committee? Or thoughts? Okay, and I got to admit, I'm not looking at the chat because I can't seem on Teams to have like the participant list and the chat at the same time somehow. I'm still working on that. So if there is something from a Climate Council member in the chat, don't assume that I've seen it. I'll just say that. And because we do have some folks on the phone, I think, like Jared, what you did, I think is good to verbalize it. Okay. So in terms of how to make this work practically, I would suggest towards the end of this meeting, we have folks raise their hand about if they would like to serve on this steering committee, and we see where we're at. And then we recommend that you get some help from someone to convene a meeting, again, a public meeting, of course, of the appointed members. And you make a little votation process quickly, or you can even do it offline, I believe, without violating any public meeting rules if it's just a link that's made public later. We will suggest a pathway on that, and I think it depends a little bit what we see at the end of this meeting in terms of the number of hands that gets raised and folks who want to do it. Lauren, go ahead, please.
Thanks, David. I think it might be helpful before people start raising their hands or considering whether or not they want to, if you, especially David, given your experience with Maine and some of the others, can flag how much of a time commitment both serving on a subcommittee as a co-chair would be and also serving on the steering committee. I think we could all be pretty interested in being as involved as possible, but understanding what's going to be asked of us in each of those roles will be helpful before we start hand raising.
Yes, thank you, Lauren. That is particularly helpful. And I think that's why it might be good for us to walk through the subcommittee conversation first and the co-chair responsibility, right? Because if we talk about both of those different types of roles, whether you're on the steering committee or you're a co-chair, those are both investments in time. And so I absolutely appreciate that comment, Lauren. I can say from a steering committee standpoint, if you can imagine the steering committee is going to need to meet at least prior to every council meeting and probably a little bit more as coordination's happening across the subcommittees. So in addition to your council meetings, you are doing planning meetings for those council meetings, and you may be doing some coordination meetings with co-chairs across the subcommittees. So that would be my assumption of the sort of level of effort. So it's a few times a month doing it. I don't have a number of hours. I'd welcome anybody who would maybe sketch that in an envelope, what that means for dedication of hours. So that's steering committees. And we can talk a little bit about what a co-chair role would look like in the next block. Okay, great. So is it fair to say, just for the moment, that for folks on the call now from the Climate Council, the idea of having a steering committee, yes, let's do it. The idea that it's probably best as a 6-person committee where you've got 2 folks from the executive branch. We already know who those 2 individuals will be. You have 2 from the appointed from the Senate folks and 2 from the appointed by the House. And we need to have a process that starts at the end of this call about how to let you all as appointed members do that. And there's a spirit behind the steering committee that it's in the service of you all as a full council in trying to guide your work in the best way possible. Okay. Does that feel like where we're at right now? Is that okay? Right. Okay, I can't see, like, since I can't see all 23 of you, there might be someone being like, no, and I don't see it. So you have to shout out if you're doing that, okay? All right, let's move forward, and then towards the end of the call, let's figure out our next steps about actually getting folks into that steering committee. Let's talk about subcommittees for a moment. As I suggested, we're envisioning subcommittees that have co-chairs, 1 co-chair from the executive branch, probably a designee of the secretary who would be a member of this council, and 1 co-chair from among the folks who are appointed by the legislature. Potentially in a rare circumstance, maybe pulling in a 3rd person, even someone from outside the council. This co-chair role is probably a significant amount of time. These subcommittees in these early phases, February, March, April, May into June, are likely be meeting very frequently, weekly or something along those lines. They will need to do a fair amount of work of pulling together existing programs, et cetera, trying to get their hands around the data, trying to get their hands around strategies and draft ideas. That's work, right? Co-chairs will be playing a key role in guiding that work and making sure it's going forward. If I understand from Secretary Moore, there will be some facilitation support, and there will be staff support from the most appropriate agency involved. Okay. I'd be interested, again, composition, relatively small, 8 to 12 members, but yes, include non-council members in that composition because you definitely need additional expertise. dealing with the sensitivities of the fact that you all as 23 members have a particular legal charge given to you by the legislature that's different than somebody who would be forming that subcommittee who's not a member of the Climate Council. And so therefore you could do a couple things there. One is you could try to really have a majority or something close, a good number of council members as part of the subcommittee. And secondly, you could make some decision-making rules when it's time to elevate your draft recommendations that says maybe only council members are the ones making decisions about what to elevate up to the full council. Reactions to subcommittees, some of the things that I've said, things you might do differently. What's folks' reactions about this as a pathway for getting your work done via the subcommittees? Again, I can't see the chat. Some clever things are being said in the chat. Kelly Klein, please go ahead.
Hi, I had a question about the thinking behind always selecting someone from the executive team as one of the co-chairs. Just curious as to why that would definitely be part of the plan from your outlined proposal.
Sure. I can give you my opinion on it, and then I welcome other council members to chime in as well. My opinion on it and what I've seen in other states is that it's actually essential to have someone from the agency, from an executive branch, committed and part of the conversation, both because they bring staff to bear, they bring knowledge to bear, and they are, in the end, going to be likely an implementing player. And so having them on board in a very major way as a co-chair allows all of that to work better. Pairing that person with someone who's not part of the agency is a nice pairing. But my experience has been having the agency involved from the get-go in helping to drive this makes for smart implementation on the back end and faster implementation on the back end. But I welcome other viewpoints on that. Anybody have a different viewpoint about that?
David, this is Julie. I would just reaffirm all of the things you said. I think having the engagement of the agencies does create the capacity for some of the staff work, and it is really important in terms of understanding the constructs of government and what we're going to be able to do and on what timeline we're going to be able to do it, and contemplating different strategies, initiatives, and programs.
Thanks. That's great. Yeah. So I don't know, Kelly, if that's the answer to your question. I'd welcome other thoughts on this or reaction. Kelly, if you want to get back in there.
I can, yeah, that makes complete sense. That was my guess, but I just wanted a little bit more clarity on the reasoning. So that makes a lot of sense to me. Especially as a lot of us who were chosen by the legislature do not have, staff or paid hours that we can dedicate to this.
Yeah, correct. Yeah. Okay. So what am I just looking at? Joanna, please go ahead.
Thank you. I think that this generally makes a lot of sense to me. I guess one question that I had raised before, and I'm still interested in terms of to inform, who else we could bring to the table, connects to the conversation about the potential to compensate people for their time, and especially folks we might want to bring into the Just Transitions Working Group. So I just want to put that out there. I don't know if this is the right time to have that conversation, but I am just, as we think about the composition and want to make sure that people who don't live and breathe this stuff like I do all day long professionally, I really would value making sure that others have the opportunity. And if that includes compensation, I'd love to explore that with you all.
Yeah, I would love to hear. Yes, I saw your hand go up, Secretary Moore. Would you want to say something about that?
Yeah, so we did flag that in the council report that went to the legislature, but it would require legislative change. We don't currently have that authority given to us in statute. And so to the extent the council members or want to follow up, or once we have a steering committee that they follow up with the legislature, I think that is really got to be the next step.
Okay. Super. And I think, you know, if anybody has a different opinion about that, but it sounds like that would be something to push forward, because it could be important in pulling in voices that otherwise would have a financial inhibition to, you know, or inability to participate. But I welcome other views about that if others have that view. Okay. Great. What else about these steering committees? Let's think about it, right? So we're trying to stand these up relatively quickly. What do we need to think about right now about their composition, their role, their leadership, how you're going to select them, that we want to talk about as a full group? Anything else? Rich? Yeah.
Well, I think you've probably already touched on this, but I think it will be important for some group, a coordinating group, probably the steering committee, to get a look at who's volunteered for what and what strengths everybody brings to those committees, where the gaps are, and kind of coordinates across committees to make sure that the council as a whole is best served by the composition. So, you know, you said in the first instance, people should self-nominate and express their interest. I think I would ask everybody, if I was setting up a process, I'd ask everybody to name, you know, if they want to be on a subcommittee, which one, and then what would be their second choice, something like that, so that the steering committee could then recommend a slate that covers the basis.
That's great. Yeah, that's really helpful. Thanks. Jared, do you want to follow up on that point?
It's a related point, but it's not the exact on the exact same thread. Is that all right?
That's fine. Yep.
So I just want to speak to the idea about a possible data and technical subcommittee. I'm definitely open to that, to the extent to which it helps us elevate and focus on an evidence-based, science-guided process. I guess I would just say that I think of the kind of following the data, the analysis, the best available analysis, science and evidence, and focusing on just transitions and baking in equity to all of both the process and the recommendations are things that should be baked into all of the subcommittees. So I'm on a guard against creating, one of them is already created for us in statute, the Just Transitions Committee, and I don't think it's worthwhile to revisit that. But I want to find a way that even if we create a fifth subcommittee, we're ensuring that the work of all of the committees, especially cross-sector mitigation, agriculture and ecosystems, and rural resilience and adaptation, that they're all centering and prioritizing, you know, the data in the technical evidence and the just transitions and equity focus, and that those don't get siloed off as separate things.
Thanks, Jared. And it's a point that we've been talking about with some of you as well. And I think you named it, that there's two committees here, the Just Transitions one and this likely new Science and Technical Subcommittee, that really have a different flavor, right? Because they're a flavor of being more at the service of the other subcommittees in their work. And so it is entirely possible for you all to say, we think those subcommittees need to get themselves going and then figure out a way to be at the service of the other subcommittees, right? Whether they embed themselves in those subcommittees or they do some other pathway of being at the service. And so I'm glad you brought up the point, Jared. It's something that's been percolating in our heads and others that we've been speaking to. So absolutely can make it that way. And there are practical ways to do that through embedding or other things like that. Are there other thoughts or things you're scratching your head about in terms of the subcommittees right now and what's being proposed? Kelly?
Yes, I had one other question, whether when we're selecting people who are not on the council to serve on the committees, will it behoove us to have some sort of nod from the legislature and the executive branch potentially about our selections? Because I don't know if that will help us in the end, if sort of protect us to make sure that people feel like we're really serving the state and we're not just handpicking people. We were selected by the legislature, and should we have that be the process in some way, or approval by them for the other members of the subcommittee? And I'm asking purely out of, I'm just asking. I don't have an agenda here. I just was curious about that.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't know if Chris, when you lifted up your hand, was it to answer that question or to work on that question?
No, actually.
Can I pause for 1 second what you're about to ask and just stick with what Kelly just said?
Oh, no, totally. No. Yeah. I'm not trying to interrupt at all.
No, it's good. So if you just hang on 1 second, and on this issue, right? So your enabling legislation specifically allows you to incorporate additional people in the subcommittees, right? So it mentions that specifically. And then Kelly brings up this idea: do we somehow want to give the legislature and or the executive branch some kind of heads up on this or approval moment? How do people feel about that? Let's just stick with that question for 1 second. Do people have a strong feeling one way or the other that would either A, serve you well in the long run, or B, be an unnecessary, slow process to, stand up your subcommittees? Richard, do you have a view on that?
Well, I think I was envisioning that nominations for participation in a subcommittee would be vetted first by that subcommittee and then shared with the council through the steering committee. In other words, committee membership in general should be something that's confirmed by the whole council. And so it would, in that sense, be automatically shared with the administration. I guess I'm not enthusiastic about saying we have to go back to the speaker or the president pro tem for such an appointment. I think we've been unable to do it, and we should feel free to do it. I'll stop at that point, and also recognize that we have the ability to engage, and you're going to talk about this later, many members of the public and many stakeholders through advisory processes, working groups, advisory meetings, public meetings, etc. So we should probably think of appointing non-council members to the subcommittees as a way to gather expertise and perhaps fill gaps in points of view, but not as something that we need to do in order to make sure that we have one of every category we can think of serving on the subcommittees.
Right, that's helpful. And before I turn to Chris and his comment, so would folks feel generally comfortable with this idea? I think with what Richard laid out, which is the non-council members who are invited to come into the subcommittees, in addition to the subcommittees themselves and the co-chairs looking at that and the steering committee looking at it, the full council, you all, does a final okay and says, yep, this looks like a great balance. This is what we need, right? going back to the legislature feels like probably an excessive step for what we're doing here. Are people comfortable with that reaction? And I apologize, Chris, that we're going on a tangent here before we get to your question. I saw some hands from Joanna, and then I see one from Secretary Attorney. But Joanna, please go ahead.
I guess I would just, the way I'm trying to think about this is I share, the reluctance to go back to the legislature and think we're unable to sort of do this and try our best at it. And what I am, optimistic about is that we're setting the stage for a durable process embedded in state government and a focus here that we haven't had yet. So I kind of like the idea as we're setting, these processes and these structures in place, ultimately we can refine, and we're going to set something in place shortly to get to work. And at the same time, was it the New York model where it felt like there's more concentric circles? Like if, there's the subcommittee and then there's the potential for advisory. I feel like this is we're going to need to embed a public engagement process that has, it's not not all the conversations are happening in just one arena or within one entity that I'm going to look at this as more of some sort of concentric circle approach where we're going to do our best not to get bogged down in process, but to bring different perspectives to the table and make sure that we're, benefiting from the expertise and perspectives and answering the how we're going to do this. I think, again, we have really solid foundations behind which to build in terms of work that has already happened. And I think I'm just looking at this as for the long haul, Yeah. So defer to Commissioner Tierney.
Yes. Let's hear from Secretary Tierney, see if she can provide some closure on this particular point. Secretary Tierney?
I appreciate the promotion to secretary. I am technically a commissioner, but really I'm June to this group. And one of my, yes, let's not be modest, one of my talents is synthesis. And so I've been listening to the conversation very carefully, and I agreed completely with the proposition that we need to go back to the legislature if we're going to spend money that we don't have permission to spend, i.e. paying folks to participate. But we don't need to go back to the legislature in order to get their imprimatur on decisions about self-governance. And that's how I distinguish between the two. I thought it would be useful if the group heard from a voice that's been a little more silent. I've been holding back just to support what Joey's saying and what Rich is saying, that we have some self-governance issues that we can decide. We're not going to get this all right all once right now, but I think what we've seen so far is a good deal of good faith from all council participants, to include the decision to bring you, David, in here today to have a facilitated discussion. And so I think that amply demonstrates that the group is capable of making good decisions right now in self-governance. And then secondly, coming back and correcting course if it proves necessary. To Joey's point about exactly how do we ensure different levels of participation and in different places. Some of that I think we're going to figure out as we go along. And for right now, I think it's probably good enough if we have a shared commitment that we want robust engagement. And we'll figure out how big to draw those circles and who all to pull in due course. But right now, we need to get going on just these committees. Those are my 2 cents.
Excellent.
Discounted for inflation.
Thanks, Commissioner. Okay, great. Let's leave that conversation there. And Chris, thanks for your patience. What did you want to bring up?
Just briefly, in a number of this has come up a number of times in conversations with the council, and then also just conversations I've had with other council members, outside of these meetings, is like how, and this is kind of a parking lot issue, but I think it's a big one, is how do the committees actually do their work under open meeting law, especially in this Zoom environment. So I think it'd be helpful just to note that probably sooner rather than later, it'd be good to have guidance from council about exactly, like a note, like we know that these subcommittee meetings are going to have to be warned. How do we share and review and comment on written documents and that kind of thing? Because the reason I'm bringing that up is, especially for folk who don't operate in this kind of full public, open and transparency world, it can feel incredibly clunky and awkward. And if we're going to bring, and we absolutely should bring more people into the subcommittees who maybe don't live in this world all the time either, it'd just be good to have that guidance. I think it might provide some comfort, because otherwise, I think there are a lot of folk right now kind of scratching their heads about, okay, exactly how on earth is this going to work? Just from a very nuts and bolts mechanics kind of thing. And like I say, we don't need to go into that right now, but I just want to throw that out there because I hear it a lot.
Yeah. Thanks, Chris. I've heard it a lot too. Yeah. Made trickier by our online environment, but not impossible. I will say, having watched Maine do it, I know New York's doing it, so it's not impossible.
Yeah, and you may have suggestions for us that would fit within Vermont open meeting law, that examples of how this worked really well with those other states too. So anyway, we can park that. I just wanted to bring it up.
Great, I'm glad you did. Thanks. Okay, so how about folks who've been listening along, council members who are sort of kind of thinking they're in agreement with this, but they're not really sure, you haven't spoken yet. Is there something you'd want to say about what this plan is for subcommittees and how to pick members and how they're going to work and how those co-chairs are going to function? Is there something you're scratching your head about and you haven't spoken yet and you'd love to voice that now? Yeah, Catherine, go ahead, please.
I just wanted to say that first, I concur with everything that's been talked about, but I wanted to ask the time frame for moving on to the next phase and how we would get to the point where we can have the subcommittees start meeting as soon as possible. So maybe I'd like to hear more about your ideas and recommendations for that and seeing how we can get there. Great.
So I'll do a quick answer, and I welcome anybody else to jump in, Secretary Moore and others. The way I assume this could work for you is after today's conversation, we have a broad agreement about the steering committee, how it's going to work, the subcommittees, and we've got a sort of next steps about how you stand those up. In about 2 weeks from now, you get back together and you finalize that process, but you will have taken steps during these 2 weeks to actually get the names going and do that hard work of like coordination and looking across, right? But you can't wait a month then to get back together to confirm it and say, yes, thumbs up, away we go. So you're gonna need some meetings sooner than a month from now. So let's call it 2 weeks from now. But what I'd love to be able to help you with today is to say, by the end of our conversation, 12:15, or where we're supposed to stop, yeah, we got the pathway. Let's talk about the specific next steps on getting these stood up, how we're going to put our names out there, how we're going to do this for the steering committee, how the appointed members are going to select those 4 individuals, and we can make some plans at the end of this conversation about that. And then 2 weeks from now, you are able to finalize all that. And then from then on, your subcommittees are basically, your steering committee is good to go. Your subcommittees are essentially stood up. And by the end of February, you can have some initial subcommittee meetings. So that's sort of my mind on it. However, I welcome Secretary Moore and others to chime in. So Secretary Moore.
Sure. No, that very much aligns with my thinking too. Our next regularly scheduled council meeting would be Monday, February 22nd. So if we targeted a meeting maybe for Monday the 8th, and my bias towards meetings is just because that's the day when the legislature is in session, so it makes it easier for the administration folks to know that we won't have unexpected demands on our time. But if we targeted exactly as you say, David, sort of a two-step process where come Monday the 8th, we're making assignments and preparing subcommittees to stand up with the hope that they may even be able to meet before the next regularly scheduled council meeting on the 22nd, if nothing else, just for a brief organizational meeting. But so that they really are prepared to launch by the end of February would be an excellent outcome from my vantage.
Excellent. Okay. So that's the vision, folks, and welcome input on that. Adjustments that you might see fit.
I'll just add that that is a great answer from my perspective. When you originally presented your slide, I got the impression that in 2 weeks we'd be approving the process for standing up the subcommittees, which seemed like an unnecessary interim step. So I'm glad that you clarified that in 2 weeks the goal is to actually have the steering committees, the subcommittees established and ready to go. So thanks.
Great. Okay. Anything else on subcommittees that is bugging people, Climate Council members? Great. Okay, and again, I'm not seeing the chat, so you're gonna have to verbalize it. I apologize. I'm just not as savvy on Zoom, on this platform, on Teams. Okay, let's talk a little bit about decision-making and public and stakeholder engagement, and then we'll circle back and do some more specific next steps on subcommittees in the steering committee, all right? So decision-making, this is obviously a tricky, nuanced issue. And I'd be interested to hear the reactions of Climate Council members as you heard me talk about it. I'm happy to put up that slide again if that's helpful. You tell me if you'd like to see it. But what reaction did it create inside of you when I presented that slide? How is that landing? How might we refine that to make it really fit the needs of this Climate Council? What are people's reactions to that? Richard, yeah.
Well, I'm really interested to hear from everybody else, by the way, just because I'm speaking up to fill the immediate void. My reaction is in two parts. The first is that I think I agree with David's pitch that a deliberate pursuit of consensus is a good thing and always to be desired. You know, it's Vermont. You know, people get together and reason together pretty well in Vermont. I've worked in a lot of other places where I guess I wouldn't suggest trying consensus, but in Vermont, I think it's possible. But it should also be possible for majority voting to be called for, that for someone at some point in a deliberative process to say, okay, it looks to me like we have a majority position, it's pretty strong, and we have one or two minority points of view, and we need to just move on. Let's have a vote and see where we are. And then I think it's also responsible for us to say that if there is a substantial and strongly held minority view, that view could be reduced to writing and included in the council's report. And I caution that there should be some frame around that, because I don't think we want, 1,000 or whatever, that, a dozen dissenting opinions every time someone has a quibble about something. These aren't Supreme Court decisions, so we don't really need to agree on every word. But the idea that if it is a position that is strongly held and rises to a level of significance that it should be reported and somebody really wants that, but I think that's fine. I suspect that it's a long report with many such minority views, people at some point will actually start to say, you know, my point isn't all that important. I think I don't have to have it in the council's final report. I've seen that happen.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, I love that framing of like, there is a threshold for this kind of including a different perspective in the final product. I think that's absolutely right, because you dilute your product if every little thing has like multiple viewpoints. Whereas you strengthen your product, if 90% of it, everybody signs off, and then there's this 10% where it's like, oh, we couldn't get everybody on board. These are the big viewpoints in their sort of respective, level of strength inside the council. Okay. Other reactions to what we're talking about here of striving for consensus, but understanding that there's pathways when you don't get there. Kelly?
Thanks. I've worked in a consensus model in the past, and I have a lot of respect for it, and I think it can be very powerful. My main thoughts, though, are that it does take education. A lot of people are not familiar with it. We're all more, I assume, pretty familiar with the democratic process because of the country we live in and the state we live in. When it comes to consensus, I would want to make sure that the council members are well educated in that consensus doesn't mean that we all agree 100% of the time. Do we have, how do we talk about that as a council? How do we make sure we're all on the same page about when it's appropriate to stand up and say, I really seriously disagree, or when is it something where you can probably say, I can live with this, as you phrased it in your slide. I thought that was really helpful. And then when it comes to running the meetings, I think even more important, there needs to be some training there if we wanted to try to have consensus as a goal, because we sort of default to a Robert's Rules of Order kind of method of, do I have a motion and all of that? And that's just how we operate, how we're used to operating. We would need some training for the leadership of these meetings to be able to change it up a little bit with the goal of consensus first. And I do agree with using voting as a fallback. I think that that's going to be really important for us because we have such a short time frame. Consensus can be a very, very slow process, but it's also, as I said, I have a lot of respect for it as a very powerful tool. And I also would second what Richard said about, especially when there's a very strong and noticeable minority opinion, that having a consensus goal helps elevate those voices that might be, we've had lots of instances in the history of our country where minority voices were quashed because they were minorities and they, maybe didn't have as many resources to bring to make their voices heard. So those are my thoughts. But yeah, my main concern would be on the education piece and the actual nuts and bolts of running the meetings, if this is what we want to adopt as our goal.
Thanks so much. That's really helpful. Absolutely. There was another hand and then it went down. So if you put your hand up, you still want to make a comment, please do. Anything else? Yeah, Abby, go ahead.
I'm not sure that this is real. I'm not trying to be, I was a strong proponent of the consensus building approach because I have lived in a community for most of my life where majority vote took away a lot of how our community was resilient and functional. And that has been a pattern throughout this state in the more outlying geographical areas. And so while I'm deeply appreciative of the ability for us to have the opinions, because I have witnessed countless policy decisions be made where the minority view was voiced and promptly pushed aside because it didn't align with the agenda that was laid out prior, or because it didn't follow the how that had been interpreted as appropriate. So I, as a farmer, have lived within this for a long time, and within education have seen this play out also. So I'm just, in the framework of equity, consensus isn't just about, I'm cognizant of the fact that the people at the table that we have here are living and breathing this for the most part, with the exception of a few of us. And I just want to ensure that we're appropriately paying attention to those of us who have voiced our opinions and constantly had them pushed aside.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for that. Okay. Are there other things that we're thinking about this right now, right? If we're going to go forth and do this. Commissioner Turney, would you like to jump in on this?
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to speak to Abby's point that what I'm hearing is a concern about being pushed aside, which is a very different proposition from being in the minority on a position. And I would just want to give you my personal assurances, Abby, that I will not be party to a process where somebody's pushed aside. And I don't think others on the council will be either. So this conversation is about how do we lay out protocols so that when there is a need to acknowledge that we can't reach consensus, but we want to be faithful to the proposition that there are minority views, how do we best honor that? It never feels good to be in the minority. I know that very well. But minority views have a way of becoming prevalent views in due course when they are appropriately recorded. And so I'll put a flag in the need for archiving our work, and I'll simply stop at Abby. You certainly can look to me to be a friend in ensuring that nobody's pushed aside. Thank you, David.
Thank you. Okay. Anything else we want to say about this decision-making strategy and sort of philosophy we want to take on, or you would take on? Anything else that comes to mind? Concerns? Okay. Let's go ahead and I invite people who are just on the phone to just unmute and jump in when you need to, okay? Council members who are on the phone. Let's talk a moment about the public and stakeholder engagement, and then we can pull it back I'll pull it all back together. I had suggested that if you look at public and stakeholder engagement in this process that you've already laid out for yourselves, the composition of your council right here, the future composition of your subcommittees brings in diverse stakeholder viewpoints, and that those subcommittees can be tasked with going out and getting other views to become part of their process too, to present, to test ideas, to do outreach, etc. Okay, so from a stakeholder standpoint of different views, that's one way to think about it. From an even broader public engagement standpoint, there's a couple things to think about, right? I suggested two sort of important milestones in your process where public engagement would be particularly helpful. One is as your subcommittees are getting ready to lift up their draft ideas to the full council, and to pause and to do a concerted public engagement effort with whatever strategy feels appropriate for you. And then the second milestone would be once you have a draft consolidated action plan, climate action plan, which, you know, if you are able to keep to this very extremely exciting, aggressive schedule you have would be sometime in early October. You could do a very concerted effort for public engagement that would help get input on that draft plan and allow you to finalize it later in October, November, and hit your December 1st deadline. Of course, Vermont has good, robust public meeting laws, and so all these meetings will be public. These meetings can include and should include periods for public engagement as you go. Even though you're having a conversation among the 23 of you or the 8 to 12 of the subcommittee members, you can create a space for public engagement. So that's kind of a vision put out there. I recognize there's tensions that you've already mentioned of like, oh my God, how do we do this in a virtual setting? Teams is kind of a difficult platform. I'll just have to admit that, even more difficult than other ones out there. So there's some logistical, practical challenges of this. But I want to test sort of where people's heads are at in terms of how to do this well, and recognize that bringing public and stakeholder engagement into the heart of your work probably will serve you even in an extremely tight timeline that you have. Where are people's heads on this? Any comments people want to make about what I put out there, or other comments about this challenge? Okay. Lauren, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thanks, David. You mentioned that this is all pretty challenging in a remote setting. I think we've experienced that over the past 2 or 3 months in doing this, but you noted that Teams is one of the more challenging of the platforms that we could be using. So in order to make this as effective as possible, shouldn't we try to transition to perhaps one of the more user-friendly platforms as you see it, David, and doing this remotely with 2 different states now?
Sure, and I know this is a challenge for the state of Vermont, and this is something I'd be happy to work with folks on in the state, but indeed, other platforms like Zoom perhaps provide better functionality for you as a council and then for the public to engage. So it's something to manage. I know it's a state challenge, and so I'll just leave it there. But absolutely, Lauren, take the point. Like, if there's a way to get a platform that's really going to make this function better for you as a council and for the public, let's see if there's ways to get the state going in that direction too. Anything else, Catherine?
I fully support that suggestion. Thank you, Lauren. I find Teams to be extremely challenging when I can't see most of the participants. And from a public engagement perspective, I just wanted to throw out that in addition to any sort of formal public engagement, I think our subcommittees will have an opportunity to specifically reach out to other groups on their own and seek input from groups as part of the process before their work is done. I could see, for example, the Rural Committee reaching out to the Legislative Rural Caucus or the Council on Rural Development Board, or some of the agricultural groups. So I see a real opportunity there for the subcommittees to take on some specific outreach where they initiate it.
Absolutely. Yep. That's great. Great. I'm seeing some more hands. Kelly?
So as far as, I agree, I'm not a fan of Teams. And I wanted to mention a couple of things that have been brought up by other council members in past meetings about public engagement. There was a suggestion of having a public engagement portal or something where people could, since there's a very limited amount of time in each of our public meetings, have another opportunity for people to engage, especially they don't have to be here during business hours. They could do it anytime. I know that they can email comments, but having it more user-friendly for them as well, I think I would like to elevate that as something that I would hope to see, and just wanted to make sure that that was in the works. And then the second one is about, one of the things about Teams is that we seemingly in the chat, it's anyone can participate at any time in the chat, and there's not really a very good way to, other than just verbally requesting it, to ask members of the public to hold their comments until the end, their written comments as well. Others have expressed that it's distracting. It doesn't, in my opinion, it doesn't seem quite fair to those who do wait until the end of the meeting to share their comments when others from the public are just posting throughout the meeting. I find it hard. I'm still trying to learn every single name of everyone on the council, and so I'm not always like, I'm like, is that a council member? Who is this person? So the chat is very useful in some ways for sharing links and things, so I don't want to just ignore it throughout the meeting. That was discussions about public engagement in the chat in Teams had been brought up, and I agree. I think other platforms like Zoom allow for different levels of participation in the chat function, and we could set different rules and sort of open it up at a certain point to the public. So wanted to bring that back up as well.
Thanks, Kelly. Absolutely. Okay, Joanna.
Thanks. Sorry, my mute button just went away. I just want to second a lot of what's already been said. Teams, challenging. I also want to second the potential for some sort of portal and the way to solicit comments in an ongoing way, not simply through email address. It could be organized in some way that could create a venue for, related to the organization of the subcommittees, the 4 or the 5 or more, where we could solicit ideas from people about, good actions. I work a lot at the local level with town energy committees. Over half the towns in the state of Vermont have these grassroots groups. We're going to need the partnership of municipalities in this endeavor. So I think really inviting people, again, under the auspices of which our subcommittees and our work is broadly framed, to offer their specific recommendations related to programs, policies, approaches, principles. That could be one way to organize a portal, which I very much support.
Thanks, Joanna. That's great. Okay. I think the 2 hands that are up are previous hands, unless I'm mistaken. And I don't have controls to lower hands and things in this program. Okay, great. And again, this is something now that a project manager's in place, Jane, that you can start to really make some progress on in terms of public engagement portals or websites and this kind of thing, right? There's learning from other states, right, where you can do drop-down menus and say, this is my comment for this subcommittee, right, or this topic. You can do that. You can, in key moments, you can do more aggressive sort of surveys and other kinds of things on a website. So there's learnings from other states about how to do that well and clearly. Okay. Anything else folks want to share around public or stakeholder engagement? Okay, great. So I took some notes, and I know my colleague Catherine's been on the phone taking some notes too, but I'm just going to share my sort of raw notes as a way of capturing where we got to, and then let's talk about the specific next steps that we want to do. Let me just try and see if this works. You all can tell me if you can see. Okay, give me 1 second. Okay. Could someone shout out if the text is too small and I can make it a little bigger? Okay. Okay, so this is me taking notes in real time, so apologies if it's not beautiful. But this is what I heard you all say as we went through. We talked about the steering committee initially. We thought, yes, generally a good idea can help get us with these sort of clarity of purpose, these lane bumpers early on. Probably 6 members is best, equal number from each group of appointed members. Should see yourself as acting in the service of the council. And we have some questions about the best way to organize the legislative appointees so they can select these 4 members that will be part of it. We can talk about that in a second. Okay, so that was steering committee. Generally, it was a thumbs up. Let's go forth and do this. Subcommittees, we talked about a bunch of things. We asked the question initially, do we really want to have someone from the executive branch as a co-chair each time? And we answered that question as yes, that seems like a good idea. The issue of compensating people for their time so that they can participate in this came up. And this is something that requires some more legislative approval. And so Secretary Moore has already started that process. And this is something that the steering committee can also push with the legislature if we feel this is important from an equity perspective. There is important role here for the steering committee in looking for that balance. And this also means you probably, when we ask you all for your choices, put a second choice too, in case there needs to be some balancing among the different subcommittees. This issue of the top possible technical science subcommittee, want to ensure that it is working at the service of other subcommittees. Jared's point there, and I had mentioned also that the Just Transitions subcommittee has some of that flavor too, of being at the service of other subcommittees. We talked a little bit about whether we need to go back to the legislature or the executive more formally about the names of folks on the subcommittees. We basically came down to, no, we think that's not needed, but yes, you as a full council should do a final look through and vetting of that and make sure it's okay. And oh, by the way, there are many opportunities to engage diverse voices. That sort of concentric circle approach that I'll forget who said it, but one of you said it. And then also that means you don't necessarily need one of everybody on the subcommittees because you can go out and solicit those viewpoints as part of your process. There was a flag about we need to really get our heads around doing this work under open meeting law, particularly when we're pulling in non-council members into that. We're going to need some help and some practical advice on getting the work done and doing it under the open meeting laws. There will be documents that we're reviewing. How do we do that in a way that's appropriate? How do we not get ourselves in trouble there? When I use the word we, I'm actually not including myself. I'm saying you as the 23, and I apologize. And then the time frame, we clarified the time frame as by 2 weeks from now. The idea is you actually have things largely ready to go and you're signing off on that. So 2 weeks from now, hopefully there's some draft composition and all that set up for the subcommittees and the steering committees going. Decision making. We talked about the deliberate pursuit of consensus is a good thing. It's also a good thing to have some backup because you're going to be moving quickly. And it's a good thing to articulate those strongly held views that aren't the majority views. And those can be in the report. There have to be some criteria so it hits a certain bar so your report's not littered with all kinds of little nuances and subtleties of different ideas. It will take some education for you all to get your heads around what that means in terms of practically running meetings and doing this. And then there's this important point that part of the idea of consensus is you're lifting up viewpoints that might otherwise get stifled if it's just majority vote, majority vote. And so there's an important piece around voices not getting pushed aside in the process. And also a mention of archiving is important, right? So you keep those viewpoints somewhere. They don't just get lost. Finally, we talked about public and stakeholder engagement, about using the right platform. Is there a chance to move away from Teams? Let's see. That's really a state of challenge in terms of what their technology office will allow. But let's see how you can do that. Subcommittees do have a chance to reach out. There's real opportunity there. So that's a really important piece to not lose because it really is sector and topic specific. There's excitement around having a public engagement website or portal or some other way that allows for asynchronous engagement. People, you would like to see that. It should allow folks to focus in on the things they want to do, invite people to solicit ideas. And then as you go forward, you can also do more specific things around draft content that's coming up and surveys and that kind of stuff. And finally, related to the platform, the chat functionality right now in Teams is difficult and not really working for you that well. So we can think about pathways on that. Okay, so those are my notes. Trying to capture what it is was the sense of the conversation, and where I didn't sense a lot of disagreement. I sensed comments that fed off each other and built off each other. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen. I'd welcome, before we go to specific next steps, if people want to shout out if I messed up that those notes at all, if you could improve those notes for me, I'd welcome that. So if any improvements to those notes would be welcome right now. Anything you saw that I didn't hit it very well. Yeah, Joanna.
Not to say that you didn't hit it well. I think you actually synthesized it very well. Thank you. Very helpful to have professional facilitation in general. Thank you. I guess one thing I would say in terms of the compensation issue that I raised, I just want to clarify, it may require legislative change if it's going to be pulled from, the general fund or the public's purse. I'm still open to the idea. And I guess, David, this is a question for you. If there's another way to raise revenue, I understood that Maine somehow, in part, I think, helped lift up their efforts through some support of private dollars, or I guess it's an open question to me about how we compensate people and where those dollars come from. And if it requires a legislative fix, maybe, but, I would be open to exploring all options beforehand. And I don't know if you could shed a little light on the question related to Maine.
Sure. I wish Hannah Pingree were on the phone because she could really shed light on it. I think the Maine, I believe what happened was the Maine legislature, in creating the council, actually in that moment also opened the door to fundraising as part of that. I believe, again, Hannah would be the right person to confirm all that. And so that opened the door to creating some fundraising to support the process. And yeah, so that was what Maine did. But I will turn to Secretary Moore and/or Secretary Young to say a little bit about any creative pathways that Vermont might have to do this sort of fundraising or support. Secretary Young?
Oh, Suzanne, you're on mute.
I love Teams too. I can speak just in my role here with the finances, that there is a process in Vermont law for a state entity to accept donations. It's clunky. It's basically, we would have to ask the legislature, actually we'd have to ask the governor to approve the acceptance of the donation, and then we would have to ask the Joint Fiscal Committee to approve the donation. We would have a plan for spending it in the off session that the Joint Fiscal Committee could approve, or the legislature may decide, hey, we've got $100,000 or $1 million donation, we're going to appropriate it somehow. So again, it's tied up in the separation of powers and the power of the purse. And but I'm thinking back, in all honesty, to what was the issue maybe now 10 years ago, where the legislature opened up a process for donations. I just can't remember off the top of my head what issue that was. Oh, genetically modified, the genetically modified organism. Was that the name of it? Yeah.
Yeah.
So they did allow in some donations to that process, and how they actually required the state to account for it and test for conflicts and the like, I don't recall. But so that's one creative way I know they've done it in the past. I don't know, Liz Miller, if you had any from your years as a chief of staff or other, any ideas?
Yeah, the Food Fight Fund for the GMO statute came to mind as well, Suzanne. We could look and see what that framework could be used to be applied here, and consider whether that's adding more process than we need or not. Whether there's something completely outside of the state council altogether, where nonprofit organizations looking to support the council's work could provide the type of support Joey's talking about, is another way that perhaps this could be looked at.
Okay, great. And Secretary Moore, did you want to say anything more on this particular funding issue?
I just add to what Liz said, or amplify what Liz said, that may be the most straightforward approach. I believe our per diem is limited to $50 a day plus expenses, which, depending on the length of the meetings and the amount of time you're asking people to commit, is a more or less robust amount of compensation. And so doing something outside the state process might be more beneficial to the outcome I think the shared outcome we all desire.
Right. Okay. Excellent. Thanks for clarifying that point. Secretary Flynn.
Thank you, David. I was also thinking of the Vermont Disaster Relief Fund that was set up in the wake of Tropical Storm Irene.
Okay, and that could be a model for this group too.
It could possibly be something to be looked at. Obviously, there have to be contributors, but that was, it wasn't governmental, but it had the blessing of the governor.
Got it.
If I have that correct. Liz may actually know a lot about that one.
That was also, I think, a private entity effort in coordination with the state. I believe it was eventually set up through the Community Foundation. So again, maybe a good model to look at how our nonprofit supporters and partners could take care of this issue in a way that would be consistent with our goals and without the kind of state processes that would otherwise slow down the ability to provide that type of support.
Great. That's helpful. Okay. Wonderful. All right. Anything else on my notes? That was a helpful clarification. Are there other clarifications or improvements to my notes, Lauren?
I'll just want to reiterate that I don't think I saw it captured in your notes, but in the beginning, when you presented some of these ideas, you noted that there should be space for the co-chairs to meet semi-regularly to ensure collaboration across and to make sure that certain guiding principles like equity are baked into each of the subcommittee's work. So I would just want to make sure that we're capturing that. I think that's a good idea and kind of necessary to reduce redundancies and build some cohesion across the subcommittees.
Great. Thanks. Okay, and we can add that in as a specific point. All right, anything else to improve where we got to? Okay, great. So I'll just note that I sense that the 23 of you, or however many of the 23 of you are on the call right now, have a level of comfort about what we're talking about, that we can move forward with these ideas that we're putting on the table now. We've just discussed, and I've tried to improve by taking some of these notes. So I'm taking that away from this conversation. I hope that you all are taking that away as well. If you're not in that space right now, you're like, actually, I'm not really ready to move forward on these ideas. Now's a good time to shout out. We have some interesting next steps to take so that 2 weeks from now, you're in a place of actually sort of confirming and finalizing and standing up these important bodies, the steering committee and the subcommittees. Let's take them one at a time and see if we can think of some clever next steps for this. For the steering committee, it seems like we should test the waters now. If there's some folks, and this is not definitive, but if there's some folks now that can see themselves as likely folks who would be part of those 4 steering committee members from the appointed members. And we can test the waters now and see what we get. And then I would, I think, probably with the help of Secretary Moore, schedule up some kind of effort, and it can be asynchronous, it doesn't need to be a meeting, in which people can nominate themselves or nominate others, and then you do a quick vote on that if you need to vote, if there's more folks than the slots allow. So I would start right now, if people either want to nominate themselves or nominate somebody else that they think would be particularly great in this role of steering committee. And I want to channel, when we do that, Lauren's voice earlier, which was, careful, we need to make sure we know what we're walking into in terms of time. So if you also would see yourself as a likely co-chair, then be realistic if, you know, being co-chair is compatible with also a steering committee role. So I would just do a word of caution about time. I'm curious, just to test the waters quickly, do we have some folks among the 23 of you, or excuse me, it's not the 23, it's the non-executive members of you, who would either want to nominate somebody or nominate yourself to say, I think I'd like to help with this role. I think I'd like to help to be on the steering committee. I'd be interested if folks want to do that right now. I better look at the chat, or just raise up your hand and let's see what happens here. Commissioner Turney, do you want to say something about this?
I do. I want to state very specifically at the outset that I will not seek to be on a steering committee and will not accept the nomination. And the reason for that is that so much of my agency's work is central to what we're going to be doing. And I already play such a prolific role in our energy policy in the state and the like that I really think, for purposes of this committee, these kinds of things ought to be done by others.
Great. Thanks for weighing in. Yep. Okay. I bet there's things going on in the chat that I can't see right now. Lauren, want to go ahead?
Yeah, David, are we allowed to make recommendations from people from a separate appointing authority? Or are we trying to keep it within our own?
No, I'm being pretty loose in terms of whether it's the House or the Senate, but again, the appointees. But again, the folks from the executive side are pretty much set with Secretaries Young and Moore.
Well, this is kind of fun to get to volunteer somebody on public record for their time. So I'll take a stab and say I would love to see Chris Campany on the executive committee.
Okay, great. That's great. Kelly, do you want to say something?
I would just second that. I had him on my short list. He's been very helpful in his advice thus far.
Great. Jared, did you want to say something?
Sorry, that was Sophia. I was just gonna, I'm on call because I have terrible Wi-Fi, but I was gonna third also. Chris Campany would be really good for that position.
Excellent, thanks. And thanks for just jumping in, I appreciate that. Jared? Jared, you're on mute if you're trying to talk.
Thank you, David. Yes, I think Chris is a great recommendation. I would also, if she would be willing, I would want to nominate Lauren Oates. I think given time and other considerations and contributions thus far, that would be a great fit. I would also be willing to serve on the steering committee.
Great, thanks, Jared. Okay. All right, Chad? Chad, hang on one second. You're still on mute.
Thank you. Yeah, having just heard that from Jared, I would nominate Jared wholeheartedly.
Right. Thanks, Chad. Okay. Chris, I don't want to put you on the spot, but if you have anything you want to mention here, this would be a good time to do it.
I'm glad my camera was off, but okay, I will do it.
Okay, great. All right. Okay, great. And I see Liz Miller. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, David. I just want to put out there, I think your framework of 6 with Senate and House side having 2 each is what we're working with. Is that right?
That's what we're working with, and let's see how it goes.
And if so, it sounds like we're awfully close, at least with some consensus building on the chat here, as I see. It looks like, if I've got this right, that's why I was hoping others would look. Jared and Lauren, I think, are on the same side of the appointments, and then Chris Campany on the other, I think, which means that we're narrowing down quite well how the steering committee could be formed, and we may want to focus with that in mind.
That is extremely helpful. Thank you. And like I said, I'm struggling to do look at the chat and the folks who are raising their hands. So help me out with that. And anybody who has the list right in front of them can also help with that. Richard, you want to go ahead?
Well, yeah, I just would like to say that I'm willing to serve the council in the most useful way I can. And that might be, you know, working on a subcommittee, or it could be on the steering committee. I'm just willing to be assigned.
Excellent. Thank you. What a great flexibility and offer. Yes, that's wonderful. Okay. So you all are looking around, right? We have potentially, I haven't asked Lauren. Lauren, how do you feel about being nominated?
I suppose I kind of earned it after offering up somebody else on the plate. Yeah, I would be happy to serve in whatever way the committee thinks is best, or the council rather.
Good. Okay, great. And so we have, Joanna, go ahead, please.
Oh, I was just gonna, I mean, in the spirit of what Rich was saying, I fully am, you know, looking forward to being of service in whatever way possible, but it looks like there's 4 great people who may fit the Senate and House structure, and without getting, you know, in front of the process or any other public comment, I mean, if those folks were willing, and or, I mean, it seems like that would move us to a comprised subcommittee of really good people.
So we don't have to decide this right now. People can take a deep breath and sort of think about it and think about balance, and there's something to do. But it is interesting that we are circling in on this. I'm trying to myself, you know, trying to figure this out into if we wanted to do the balance between the House appointed and the Senate appointed folks. For those of you who have quicker minds than mine, where are we right now on that? If we have names that are on the table are Jared, Lauren, Chris, and Richard, Joanna, where are we at right now? Should I be looking at the chat? Is that where all the action's happening?
You've got 2 and 2 at least on that list.
Sorry, David, that was my awkward way of saying if we have 2 and 2, unless others want to nominate themselves, it seems like a tidy composition of that is in service of the structure we talked about.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So just everybody think about it for 1 sec, right? Think about the balance you'd want to have, the different voices you'd want to have on this steering committee to help you guide the process. This is a good time if someone's looking at it like, oh, you know what? It'd be really good to have so-and-so, or it'd be really good to have this kind of voice. Think about it for a second.
And David, this is Catherine, if you can hear me.
Yeah.
I have been monitoring the chat, and there have been a couple of other suggestions coming up in the chat. So
great.
Since you can't read them, you know, folks have suggested Liz, folks have suggested, there's another one, Johanna. Yeah. So I think that's not, I think you're probably wise to just continue to collect some of the names and maybe pause and have the final decision be made after the meeting.
So I think having a deliberative approach might be helpful, even though it's so tempting to claim this victory of like, we got it. I would second Catherine's, my colleague Catherine's advice that it looks like we've got a lot of good possibilities here. And why don't we figure out an offline mechanism to just confirm the right pathway, and we'll do that by the House and Senate, and you can pick the top two names there that most compel you to get the right balance. Kelly, do you want to make a comment on that?
Just briefly, I think a lot of people, I really appreciate the willingness to serve in whatever way is most useful, and the fact that we have at least 4 subcommittees that are going to need co-chairs from the people selected by the legislature. So I think the fact that we have a great set of people who are all willing to serve in certain ways, taking a step back and sort of deliberating about where people will be able to serve best, and bearing in mind that there are a lot of people who will be in a leadership role in some way, and not everybody on the council can probably commit the time to either the steering committee or the subcommittee's chair. So
great. So why don't we do this? Why don't we make an immediate follow-up where we can work with staff and Secretary Moore and send out an email to all the council members with just a little quick polling link so that you can make a final decision. We will use names of folks on here, and we can follow up and make sure everybody really wants their name on there. When you think about subcommittees, indeed, we're going to need 5 sets of subcommittee co-chairs, right? For the 5 different subcommittees we've been talking about. So as you're sort of thinking about where you'd like to put your time, there's probably some value in thinking about where, if you might want to put prioritize your time in a subcommittee rather than steering committee. Speaking of such things, I think it would be helpful in that spirit if we want to do a similar shout out on subcommittee chairing, just to sort of get people's minds working about this. We have the 4 mandated subcommittees from the legislation, right? Rural Resilience and Adaptation, the Cross-Sector Mitigation Subcommittee, which clearly will need to have some working groups inside of it on the different sectors, transportation, buildings, et cetera. You've got the Just Transition Subcommittee, and you've got the 4th subcommittee, which Ag and Ecosystems, if I remember correctly. And now we are also talking about adding a Science and Technical Subcommittee. So I think it'd be interesting, and if you want to throw it in the chat or elsewhere, to say, you know what, I'm available for this, to help out in a leadership role in one of those subcommittees. It's not a bad thing to shout that out now, and we can sort of look at that, and then it becomes part of our puzzle as we try to put this all together in the coming days. So if you haven't put your hand up or put it in the chat that you'd be interested in a particular subcommittee, why don't we do that now? And I'm happy to just do it in the chat if that's where